Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today for this valuable webinar, and I'd like to thank you, Andrita, and the Professional Evaluation and Certification Board for inviting me to speak to you today about ISO 45001. I'd like to remind you that you can type your questions in to the chat screen during the webinar, and we will address the questions at the end. So let's start off with a bit of an introduction. I'm really honored to be here today to talk to you about how to evaluate the return on investment for implementing ISO 45001. The ILO states that every 15 seconds, a worker dies from work-related injury or disease, and 153 workers experience a work-related accident. 6,300 people die as a result of occupational injuries or work-related diseases. 3.17 million accidents occur on the job annually. For many who survive workplace accidents, disability impacts their ability to do fruitful work, and it puts an even heavier burden on them and their families. And this just breaks my heart, and it stokes my passion for this field of work and for the value of standards. Now, when I was in university studying for my degree in occupational health and safety, one of my professors said something that I have never forgotten. Peter Strallendorf said, every accident in the workplace is a result of a failure of the management system. He went on to explain that it was a failure of the system, not necessarily a failure of management or a manager. I grasped onto this concept, and I really committed myself to understanding how management systems are designed, how they work, and why they sometimes fail. I've dedicated the last 20 plus years of my career to helping organizational leaders understand the value of management systems in achieving their strategic goals and operational objectives. I spent several years managing occupational health and safety in unionized manufacturing facilities in Ontario, Canada. The next several as senior occupational health and safety consultant, helping the leading occupational health and safety lawyer in Canada, Norm Keith, to lead a national team providing training, consulting, and legal services to clients across Canada. And 6 years as a project manager in the Occupational Health and Safety Group with CSA Group, with a portfolio that included national adoption of ISO 31000, harmonization of CSA Z142, the robot standard, with ISO 10218, and the development of some groundbreaking new management system standards, including in areas of occupational health and safety training, hazard identification and risk assessment, confined space entry, and psychological health and safety. And all of those standards have now become national standards of Canada. I started HALE Health and Safety Solutions in 2013 to focus on furthering my mission, in particular in the area of psychological health and safety and worker well-being. I am a firm believer in integrating standards into the way that we do business. And while I'm happy to know that I'm doing my small part in helping make the lives of workers better, I know that we still have so much work to do. So I want to thank you for joining me in my mission to help build strong and resilient organizations through protecting and promoting the health and safety of all workers. By now you may know that the global adoption vote is in, and it's formally a yes. Publication of ISO 45001 is expected during Q1 of 2018. Now, this is not a webinar on the content of ISO 45001. There are many great speakers covering that. This webinar focuses on the key questions that business leaders need answered in order to determine whether to implement ISO 45001 in their organization. Why am I doing that? Because executives need to clearly understand the value of investment so that they can make fully informed decisions, and for many to demonstrate due diligence in their financial and legal responsibilities to the stakeholders that they must answer to. ISO 45001 is very comprehensive, and it requires allocation of appropriate resources in areas such as human resources, financial, natural resources, infrastructure, and technology. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk about why a systematic approach to health and safety is essential to the success and sustainability of today's organizations. We're going to talk about how implementing ISO 45001 will impact the ability of the organization to achieve its current and future strategic goals and operational objectives, and how to identify and evaluate comprehensive measurement criteria to demonstrate the return on investment. Now, my goal is to help you clearly understand whether your organization should consider implementing ISO 45001 and how to determine what criteria you should be measuring to see the real value on investment. Your likelihood of success improves with the allocation of appropriate resources, and resources will only be put where executives can justify the expenditure. It doesn't matter whether your organization is public, private, not-for-profit, large, or small. Make no mistake, it's all about the resources and their ability to generate a return. So let's start with talking about why a management system approach is essential for business success. Before we dive into ISO 45001, I want to go through a basic understanding of what's happening in our workplaces around the world, because work is evolving. Workplaces are evolving. And while work accidents used to be the primary cause of death of workers, global estimates of occupational accidents and work-related illnesses report for 2014 revealed that work-related illnesses have now far eclipsed work accidents. But make no mistake, there's still 300,000 people dying every year in workplace accidents. But the balance has shifted. Now there are 2 million people worldwide dying from work-related illnesses, and these are caused by things like exposure to hazardous substances, as well as chronic disease from workplace stress. Workplace accidents and fatalities are felt immediately. However, the impact on the workforce by work-related ill health should not be underestimated. In fact, work-related injuries and illnesses cost our economies between 1.8 to 6% of GDP, and that's just what we know of. But with the extreme increase in chronic diseases like cancer, for example, it is likely much, much higher. Data is generally underreported and underestimated, and the ILO report points out that the lack of statistics in numerous countries actually leads the decision makers to believe that the impact of poor working conditions and the burden of work-related disease is substantially lower than the true situation. And this causes fewer resources to be allocated to preventive work, which in turn has a negative impact on safety and the welfare of workers, as well as on the productivity of the industry and on the availability of the workforce due to disability, for example, especially in countries with a non-favorable demographic situation. Now, this is a vicious cycle. Resources need to be allocated to health and safety to keep our workers healthy and productive and to strengthen our economies. Now, health and safety is changing. The face of health and safety is changing. Health and safety must now also address the effects of work-related stress. As the pace of work increases, workplace bullying, harassment, violence, and excessive stress are causing a worldwide epidemic that is disabling and killing our workers at increasing rates. Depression and anxiety are at an all-time high. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 10 workers have a mental illness. 1 in 4 experience a mental health condition sometime in their lifetime. And get this, depression is the leading cause of disability. And suicides related to work issues are on the rise. The National Institute for Occupational Health, Safety and Health, NIOSH, in the US, found that between 2003 and 2010, a total of 1,719 people died from suicide in the workplace. For many workers and their families, access to mental health services and social justice may be limited. The workplace can actually cause or contribute to mental injury and mental illness, but it can also be support good mental health And with the right processes in place, it can facilitate high productivity from its entire workforce, including those who suffer from mental illness. It's really about giving workers at all levels what they need for optimum performance in the job that they're doing. When needs and expectations are met, people experience less stress. They can focus better. They are more intrinsically motivated. They are happier, and they are less likely to be involved in conflict. They are also less likely to be injured or to become ill. And that is good for business, no matter where the organization is operating. Now, since occupational health and safety is not just physical, but also mental and psychological, as defined in ISO 45001, there are so many factors that can impact it. Using a management system is really beneficial. So what is a management system? Well, according to ISO, a management system is the way in which an organization manages the interrelated parts of its business in order to achieve its objectives. Now, the management system approach is all about managing risk effectively, and that's why it works so well. As agreed by experts, ISO management system standards help organizations improve their performance by specifying repeatable steps that organizations can consciously implement to achieve their goals and objectives, and to create an organizational culture that reflexively engages in a continuous cycle of self-evaluation, correction, and improvement of operations and processes through heightened employee awareness and management leadership and commitment. And these are key, and we're going to talk about these in more detail. The benefits of an effective management system to an organization include more efficient use of resources and improved financial performance, improved risk management and protection of people and the environment, and increased capability to deliver consistent and improved services and products, thereby increasing the value to customers and all other stakeholders of the organization. Management system standards are the result of consensus among international experts with expertise in global management, leadership strategies, and efficient and effective processes and practices. And they can be implemented by any organization, large or small. And I can tell you that after years of being involved in standards development, this is a very, very detailed process, and it really is something to be involved in. And if you're not involved in standards development, I would strongly urge you to get involved. Now, why is management system approach so important? Because using a defined management system helps you to ensure consistency in your approach, your documentation, your training, your methods of communication, your planning. It helps to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. It takes into account the interconnections between different aspects and elements of the work and the worker and the environment in which the organization is operating. It will take time and effort to set up initially. If you haven't already got a management system in place, for sure it's going to take a lot of time. And if you already have a management system in place, bringing it up to the standard of ISO 45001 will take additional time and effort. But it's well worth the investment of time and effort saved, because work-related injuries and diseases are more costly than most executives and managers realize. So ISO 45001 will help to address the issues that we've just talked about. So now let's have a look at what the impact is. How will ISO 45001 impact your organization's ability to meet its strategic goals and objectives? Most organizations have established corporate values and strategic goals, like what you see on the screen here. For the occupational health and safety management system to really work, it needs to be integrated into the strategic direction of the organization, and it must be one of the filters through which all strategic and operational decisions are made. A recent Harvard Business Review report noted that there's a real disconnect between the intentions of executives for the workplace that they're seeking to create and the reality of how these intentions are translated into action at an operational level. And quite often, this involves a failure to be able to communicate it effectively, but a failure to really understand what's going on in the organization and what people really need in order to reach and achieve those corporate values and strategic goals. And it all comes down to risk management. Whether affected by an occupational injury or a disease, including physical or mental injury, loss of a worker impacts the business. And depending on the nature of work, the loss of skills, knowledge, or activity can throw a gap into the workflow, and that can have rippling effects throughout the organization. And this can impact the organization's ability to fulfill its mandate and its responsibilities. This is actually a risk statement from one of my clients who have said that if they had a breakdown in people or systems, it can impact their ability to fulfill their mandate and responsibilities. Now, ISO 45001 is being published at a very significant point in the evolution of business and work around the world. It is a revolutionary standard, and it is very forward-thinking, which is good for as we're going forward. It is taking occupational health and safety into the true realms of leadership. And while there's many requirements in the standard that have generated considerable discussion and disagreement, such as the requirement for worker consultation and participation, there really is one core issue that your organization must focus on if they want to successfully implement ISO 45001 and get returns. Get this right from the beginning, and the rest will fall into place much easier. Miss this, and your organization will not get the full benefit of ISO 45001, and they will continue bleeding money. ISO 45001 focuses on occupational health and safety risk. It does not focus on the hazards, but on risk. Not to say that it ignores hazards, it certainly doesn't. It also focuses on ensuring demonstrated and visible leadership, and also on integration of occupational health and safety into the very fabric of the organization. Like I said, so that it is the filter through which all decisions are made, no matter what the area is that's being discussed. So let's have a look at the structure of ISO 45001 management system. Notice that it does not begin with policy. It actually begins with understanding the context in which the organization is operating and the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties before it gets into going through the plan, do, check, act process. So understanding the organization and its context and the needs and expectations of workers and interested parties really sets the basis. It sets the focus of the entire management system. Then you get into planning, figuring out how to address the risks and opportunities that you've identified, identifying hazards and assessing the risk, determining legal requirements, carrying out action planning, setting objectives and plans for achieving them. Then it goes into section 7 and 8, where it goes into determining the support and resources that are going to be needed to ensure success. And this is critical. So it takes a lot of planning to get around to that. And it talks about how to address occupational health and safety risks and opportunities throughout all the operations of the organization. Clause 9 covers checking, evaluating the performance of the system in effectively improving occupational health and safety. And note that management review is part of the check phase. And then it goes into acting, which is clause 10. And that is addressing failures of the system, whether it's incidents or non-conformances, and putting in corrective action and continual improvement. Now, there's a common misconception about the management system that ISO 45001 has clarified, and I love it for this. Planning is not a single event, but an ongoing process, anticipating changing circumstances and continually determining risks and opportunities, both for workers and for the occupational health and safety management system. So you see, often management systems are seen as a cycle, and while there is a cycle involved, that PDA cycle is actually constantly in motion, and it is layered throughout everything that the organization does. So think of it more like a car. When you think about a car, there are many, many systems, but all those systems are working together in order for the car to operate well. If there's a failure in one of those systems, it may affect the operation of the car, or it may just affect that area. But if that failure is not addressed, very often it will actually lead to a failure of the whole car. Also, this planning is not to be done in a silo. It should be integrated with other business processes, such as management of the environment, quality, business continuity, risk, financial, or human resources. Now, note that the whole system works within the context, and it revolves around the core of leadership and worker participation. And these may be new concepts to many organizations. In fact, management systems themselves are a new concept to many organizations. Now, notice that this standard is process-driven. It is not procedure-driven. It requires processes for all the activities listed on your screen. It defines process as a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transforms inputs into outputs. Now, I agree with this definition, but I also feel that it doesn't get down to a nitty-gritty understanding of what is involved in the transformation. When I think about processes, I think, what are the steps involved? What are the resources needed? Who needs to be involved to achieve success? So, who needs to be involved? What needs to be done? When, where, why, and how? Processes involve planning, and they are interconnected with other processes required by the standard, as well as with other processes in the organization. So let's talk about how ISO 45001 views occupational health and safety risk. Clause 6.1.2.2 requires a process for assessing risk from identified hazards, as well as for risks related to the organizational context and the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. So the standard starts with requiring that the organization determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its OHS management system. Now, that one sentence is a very loaded requirement, but it is so necessary for managing risk. As stated in the annex, internal and external issues can be positive or negative, and they can include conditions, characteristics, changing circumstances that affect the occupational health and safety management system. This includes things like the cultural, social, political, legal, financial, technological, economic, and natural surroundings, market competition, international, national, regional, local considerations. It looks at new competitors. It also looks at knowledge of products and organizational modes. It looks at key drivers and trends that are relevant to the industry that could have an impact on the organization. And it looks at relationships with and perceptions and values of interested parties and other things, internal issues such as governance and organizational structure and roles and accountabilities and policies and objectives and information systems and culture and relationships. So there's a lot to be taken into account there. But it all gets down to looking at what can actually impact occupational health and safety, because the goal of the standard is to prevent injury or ill health to workers and provide healthy and safe workplaces. Now, this is going to be a challenge for any organization, whether they're large or small, but small organizations, while having less resources to actually do the assessment, may actually be better able to do it simply because of their smaller size. And they're likely to be less complex. They're likely to have fewer constraints on decision making. Whereas large organizations tend to be more complex, they'll have more people, more levels, more departments and operations and policies and procedures and politics and bureaucracy. They're also likely to have more issues with workplace conflict, trust, turnover, and possibly even with regulators. So the standard starts with stating that you need to determine what the organizational context is, and they give a list of these in Annex A4. I just went through a few of them. this information is going to feed into all aspects of the occupational health and safety management system. And it's not going to be static because the context of the organization may change with changing external and internal issues. So it needs to be reviewed again and again at planned intervals as part of the overall management review process required by Clause 9.3. So how is this going to impact your organization? Well, first of all, it's going to take time and resources to gather this information and present it in a usable manner. And this doesn't need to be complicated. Insurance companies have been doing this kind of analysis for years, and that's how they determine their rates, by getting good understanding of the context. The risk map that you see on the screen is an example of a relatively simple risk map. It gives a quick visual of some of the key context issues that can impact claims, and you can see by the colors and the size of the boxes what the interconnections are, as well as the relative size of the risk. Your organization will need to define a process and allocate resources for undertaking the assessment. This can be done through a team approach with a facilitator running a brainstorming session, or you may hire a consultant to undertake the assessment, or you might delegate it to an internal employee. Whatever way your organization decides on, they will need to assign appropriate resources and time to complete the assessment, because this is foundational to the success of the standard. What is included in the assessment is not prescribed, but it is recommended in the annex. So it is up to the organization to determine, but since the annex does include those lists, it's strongly suggested to use them. Second, this information needs to be documented. So you will see in Clause 7.5 that certain information is needed for effective operation of the occupational health and safety system. This must be documented, including specific information about the organization and legal and other requirements, for example. If you don't document both the process that you use and gather this information, that you use to gather the information and the information gathered, it's going to be more difficult and cumbersome every time your organization goes through it. So developing the process up front will save you a ton of time, energy, frustration, and money. Now, the true value of this requirement is that it helps top management really understand how the occupational health and safety management system can be affected in their organization. It will help with fulfilling leadership requirements. Understanding the context empowers the organization to identify and map interconnections and break down silos. And this means that decisions will be clearer. There will be a clearer understanding of how the decisions and actions in different areas of the business can affect risk and empower the organization to jump on opportunities for improvement that they otherwise may not have realized. Overall, it should help the organization be more competitive. So, for example, understanding key drivers and trends, if you're implementing new technology in a workforce that's experiencing economic hardship, that can seriously impact the mental health of workers, and it can damage productivity and lead to increased risk of injury. So the organization might take steps to implement programs that will help to keep workers working productively. This could be health and safety programs, but it could also be things like money management skills that will help them with their own mental health and helping them to gain access to external resources such as healthcare. Next, Clause 4.2 requires the organization to determine needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. The standard doesn't contain a lot of guidance on this, but it is extremely important for success. So how does this impact the organization? Again, you need a process to gather and document this information, to identify who the other interested parties are and what makes them interested parties. For example, the organization's neighbors, government, unions, contractors, suppliers. You need to gather information from workers about their needs and expectations on how to keep them healthy, safe, and productive. You need to gather information from other interested parties about their needs and expectations. So, for example, if you're dealing with government, what do they expect as far as compliance? What do they expect as far as reporting obligations? And what do they expect as far as keeping your own workers safe? And you need to determine which needs and expectations are legal requirements or could become legal requirements. So you may want to maintain a list of all occupational health and safety legal requirements that are applicable to the business, but it goes beyond occupational health and safety law because the standard reference is more than just physical. It also talks about mental and psychological. So you must also consider legislation around workers' compensation, human rights, and accommodation. And also, what applicable standards are referenced in the legislation that apply to the needs and expectations expressed, and what voluntary standards, codes, guidelines, and industry best practices may apply. Why is this so important? Because studies show that when needs and expectations go unmet, there is a higher risk of injury, illness, and conflict, and that impacts production and production of goods and provision of services. So this may require using surveys, interviews, discussions. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Just look at what you've already got and maybe improve on that. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. Now, this can get really messy if you're not careful. So it's really important to define the terms, needs, and expectations. And you need to define the parameters before you begin seeking input. This isn't about holding hands and singing Kumbaya or making everybody happy. It is about building trust that the organization is seriously addressing what's needed to ensure that the work is not going to negatively impact the health and safety of workers and others, for example, neighbors. If you start by just going and asking people what they need and expect without being prepared to act on those needs and expectations, it can really backfire. If you don't have a process in place for gathering the information and a strategy for being able to implement some actions right away, you could be setting your supervisors and managers up for failure and damage the trust between top management, supervisors, and workers. So gathering this information is not just a one-time activity either. You're going to have to go back to them again and again as things change. And again, this is going to involve time and resources. So another aspect to keep in mind is that it's not just about physical health and safety. It also brings mental and psychological into the realm as well. And this is new, but it's very timely. And considering the evolving risks of our workplaces, for example, more technology and a faster pace and more globalization, and the issues that our workers are having to deal with, it really could be the single most impactful requirement in the entire standard. You see, it's really about risk, and I keep coming back to this. Now, the standard defines risk as the effect of uncertainty. And absolutely, I agree with this, and there's a number of notes that go along with that that explain it in more detail. Now, I'd like to go back to one of the first things that I learned in occupational health and safety that I've never forgotten, and it was Peter Sandman's description of risk and the fact that communication with stakeholders is the single most important factor in managing risk. In every situation, let me repeat that, in every situation that I've ever dealt with that involved conflict between workers and management over occupational health and safety issues, it was because workers were outraged at the apathy on the part of management to consider their needs and expectations for their health and safety. And when accidents occur or the public learns that health and safety is at risk because of activities of the organization, they are outraged. And with social media today being the outlet where outrage is most often and effectively vented, and let's face it, that's not going away anytime soon, it makes plain sense to manage the perception of occupational health and safety risk among workers and other interested parties. It's really a reality of doing business today, and the requirements for determining needs and expectations and for internal and external communication can really help an organization effectively manage this. So it really gets into worker consultation, and consultation can be done through worker representation. In organizations with established health and safety committees, they generally already have worker representation and consult on some, if not all, of the requirements already, like what you see. And these are the requirements in the standard for worker consultation. So now remember that consultation does not necessarily mean agreement, but it certainly means consulting with workers and understanding what their needs are and letting them have some input into how you're actually managing health and safety. Now, in my experience, the most often missed area for consultation is usually on determining controls for outsourcing, procurement, and contracting. And this is really important because whether your organization is multinational or a small business, the risks associated with outsourcing, procurement, and contracting can seriously impact worker health and safety and can seriously impact the reputation of the organization, the sales of the organization, and the ability to fulfill their mandate. Let me give you an example. You may remember the building collapse in Bangladesh in 2013 that killed more than 230 workers in a garment factory, working for several brands that were outsourced. Now, let me clarify, I'm not trying to single out any one company over another. This is just one example of many where the organization did not consult with workers and they did not consider the needs for their health and safety. Now, this really led to an outcry on social media, and I personally know of many people that won't even buy those brands anymore because they were so outraged at the organization's lack of consideration of the health and safety of these people. Now, procurement is another area where it really gets into the needs and expectations, and this is so that workers can actually do their work safely and productively. For example, it'll help you fulfill requirements for human factors and for managing the risk, and it will help with ensuring that people with disabilities are actually able to do the work safely and productively. So it provides a more inclusive workplace and it helps to keep workers at work. It will also help with consulting with workers with respect to compliance with the new GHS requirements that are coming into place. I've developed several contractor and safety procurement management systems for organizations, and in all of them, when you consult with non-managerial workers to ensure there's a clear understanding of the hazards and risks and the needs and expectations, you're able to avoid a lot of serious situations. Now, ISO 45001 also requires that an organization establish a process for assessing risk from identified hazards and for identifying and assessing the risk that can occur from issues identified through understanding the context and the needs and expectations. Now, many organizations understand how to identify hazards, but they don't really have a grasp on risk assessment, especially in the area of mental injury or psychological health and safety. And this includes large, sophisticated organizations as well as small ones. And this is really important because how can an organization possibly address all the hazards identified? Every organization faces the same challenge, how to effectively allocate limited resources for the greatest return on investment. So the risk assessment in itself will not guarantee that workplace injuries or illnesses won't occur, but it is the most valuable process that you can use to help prioritize what activities to allocate resources to, when and how much, and to ensure that there's a budget and contingency plans to address that risk appropriately and in a timely manner. So this will also help to minimize that outrage. It will help with communication with a reasonable and acceptable action plan, and it will maximize your return on investment. You simply cannot accurately measure return on investment without assessing risks and opportunities. Now, risk is controlled through application of a hierarchy, and one of those key elements is competence. And yes, this is going to require resources to ensure that all workers, especially management and even top management, are competent in what they're doing. And again, this is going to mean that you're going to need a process. So what you see on the screen here is a simple competence matrix showing each position or job category within the organization, what the training requirements are. There's many ways to do it, but it really doesn't get down to understanding the detail of what needs to go into ensuring that competence. So again, although the standard doesn't specifically require a process for determining and managing competency requirements, it's really a good idea to have a process in place, because then you're able to look at not only what the training requirements are, but how they're going to be delivered, what type of training, how are you going to ensure that the transfer of knowledge and skills and abilities is really what the organization needs and what the particular worker needs in order to do their work safely and productively. And again, that comes back to consultation with workers and understanding the organization and its context and making sure that what you're providing is actually what's needed. Because let's face it, training costs a lot of money. You want to get the best value out of whatever training, whatever apprenticeship, whatever experience you're building in your workforce. Now, I simply cannot stress the importance of documentation enough. And if we have a saying in occupational health and safety that if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. And in my previous work in helping organizations prepare defense cases under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you know, the #1 charge against employers was for failure to take reasonable precautions. And in many cases, the safety processes were in place, but there was a lack of documentation to prove it. And when you have to go back and dig up documentation or try and prove that you've done something and you don't have the documentation to prove it, that ends up costing way more in the long run than having the documentation in place in the beginning. So I'm really pleased to see that ISO 45001 outlines the documentation requirements as clearly as it does. Now, integration is key, and this is really important because integration helps to make sure, again, as I mentioned earlier, that you're looking at everything that the organization is doing through that health and safety lens. And part of that includes ensuring that management of change is addressed. So whether it's products and services, legal requirements, knowledge about information, hazards and risks, developments in technology, having a management of change process, again, going back to understanding that context and the needs of workers and other parties is going to be key for moving forward. And having that management of change process is just crucial. Now, it comes down to leadership and commitment. I mentioned leadership earlier. John C. Maxwell is a guru, and he's one of my favorites in the leadership realm. And he says that leadership is the capacity to care, and in caring, to liberate the ideas, energy, and capacities of others. Now, the standard doesn't say that, but the standard does prescribe things that top management must do to conform with the standard. So I strongly urge you to pay attention to what ISO 45000 states about the requirements to demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the overall management system. So I'm going to finish up with just a bit of information about how to evaluate the return on investment for your organization. And I want to remind you that in the standard, they do list right up front in clause 0.3 the success factors needed. These are the things that you're going to look at to determine the value of investment. Do we have the leadership, commitment, and responsibilities and accountability in place? How supportive is our culture? Do we have communication in place? How strong is our worker consultation? Are workers participating? Have we allocated the right resources? Do we have clear OHS policies that are compatible with the strategic objectives of the organization? Do we have processes for hazard identification, risk control, and opportunities? Have we a system in place for evaluating the performance and monitoring the system? Is it integrated with all of the business processes, or are decisions being made that are negatively impacting health and safety of workers? Are decisions being made that are causing us not to be able to capitalize on opportunities to improve? Is it fully aligned? And are we in compliance with our legal requirements? So these are things that you should be looking at. Now, organizational health, this is really a key aspect of putting the system in place. And again, I like to look at leaders in areas of organizational leadership, and Patrick Lencioni is one of them. And he says that organizational health involves the organization being smart in areas of strategy, marketing, finance, and technology, but that's not all it's about. It's about creating a healthy organization where there's minimal politics, minimal confusion, high morale, high productivity, and low turnover. And in my opinion, adopting ISO 45001 can help an organization tap into this competitive advantage. So when you're looking at at the return of investment, I'd like you to look at the overall value of investment. Now, this is going to be a new term for some people. Traditionally, we've looked at return of investment as the key metric for occupational health and safety, or the key metric for anything, really. And it typically involves looking at the cost of personal protective equipment, for example, or training compared to the money saved through reduced accidents, insurance premiums, rebates, where applicable, and so forth. It's often calculated through reduction in absenteeism, and it's based on full-time equivalency at a standard rate of salary or payroll. But research from the team of organizational health researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health suggests that it's even more meaningful to consider the overall value of investment, which includes the financial return on investment, as well as other qualitative measures like improved customer service and satisfaction, improved quality, improved labor relations, morale, public perception. These are things that we touched on earlier. And this really gets down to understanding where the organization is bleeding money and stopping the wound. So top management must have a broader and more holistic understanding of the true impact of the health and safety management system if they're really going to understand the value of investing. So, for example, what you see here is that investing in ISO 45001, you should be looking at, is it going to improve our use of resources? And if you're having an integrated system that really understands the needs and expectations of workers and really understands the context in which you're operating in, you will have better use of resources. You will have better labor relations. You will have increased morale, better productivity, improved efficiency, improved quality, customer service, public perception, and you will be able to attract and retain talent and skilled labor. So these are all areas that you should be measuring to determine the value of investment. You will also see and be able to measure that you'll have reduced costs associated with absenteeism, and that's whether it's work-related or even non-work-related, because it affects us in, we are complex beings. It affects us even in outside of work. So being able to keep people in the workplace is key. Presenteeism may be a new term for some people, but this is basically where you're at work, but your mind is somewhere else, so you're not being fully productive. So by, as I said, addressing those needs and expectations of workers, that's really going to help with being focused and productive. You'll have reduced costs with downtime, less costs associated with addressing conflict and investigating accidents and non-conformances. Insurance premiums should go down. Claims should go down. The costs of training and retraining should be less, because you're going to be more focused on what people really need, and you won't have to retrain so many people with such high turnover. It'll have reduced costs with regulatory enforcement and, of course, with mediation and legal fees, which can just be astronomical. So in summary, I'd like to mention that it's time to improve your results. So what should you be doing now? Have a look at the standard, establish what your business case is, conduct a preliminary review to see what do you have in place and what are the gaps. Where would you need to put time and resources in order to make ISO 45001 work for you? Determine what your criteria are for success and estimate a timeline and necessary resources needed, and consider the value of investment. And I'd be happy to help you with any of those. Now, I'd just like to turn it over to Andrita to quickly talk about training courses that are offered by PECD, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for this great webinar. It's an honor to have you as our presenter. I want to inform you that PECB offers training and certification services for OSAS 18001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. This standard helps you in reducing your workplace hazard and also protecting the safety, health, and welfare of the people engaged in your workplace. Also, please be informed that upon the publication of ISO 45001, PCB will offer training and certification services worldwide. Now, we will go ahead with the question and answer session. Let us start with the first question. What are the differences between OSAS 18001 and ISO 45001? What has changed?
Oh my goodness, that is a pretty loaded question. Well, there is a lot that's changed. There is a lot that's still the same, but some of the main changes are some of the things that I focused on. So, for example, requiring worker consultation. That is one of the main changes. Having a risk assessment process. These are the two main changes that I would say are the differences between OSAS 18001 and ISO 45001. And the main things that you're going to have to do if you're looking at moving from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001 is determining, whether you have that process in place for identifying that context. ISO 45001 is designed to fit in with the high-level structure, which fits in with other management systems developed by ISO. OSAS 18001 was not designed that way. And while there's a lot that has been brought over from OSAS 18001, things like identifying hazards and making sure that you've got training in place and that you have emergency systems in place and evaluation. The way that the structure is put together has changed. So there's a lot more focus on the responsibilities of top management. There's a lot more focus on accountability of top management. There's a lot more focus on worker consultation. There is a lot more focus on risk assessment. So as I mentioned in the presentation, you need to have those risk assessment processes in place, whereas previously what we were looking more at was how do you actually control the hazards. With ISO 45001, it's a broader scope. So it's not just focused on the hazards that can impact the workers of your workplace. It's also focused on the hazards that the hazards and the risk that the work of the organization can present to not just workers, but to others as well. So, for example, neighbors in the area that might be affected by the work of the organization. So, whether it's, for example, we had a propane explosion here in Toronto many years ago, and it affected the public, in homes for quite a radius around it. So things like that are brought into ISO 45001 that may not have been considered in OSAS 18001.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your answer. We will move to the next question. How do you encourage top management to implement an appropriate occupational health and safety system when they are not meeting the bottom line or return on investment?
Yeah, well, this is really important, and this is why you need to do the business case and having a look at it in a more integrated fashion and really understanding what are those measures for the value of investment. And that's why I talk about the value of investment on a broader sense, because when they're not meeting the return on investment, they're probably not measuring the right things. They don't realize just how much money they're actually bleeding by not including all of those measures that I talked about near the end. So if we were to go back to, just go up here again. So if we're to go back to these measures, if you look at all of these different areas, of the business and how physical, psychological, and mental health and safety is impacting all of those areas of business. You'll be able to put together a business case that really speaks to top management about the value of implementing a health and safety management system, because they'll the numbers will speak for themselves when you're able to show that it impacts all of these areas, and you're able to show that you'll be able to have reduced costs in all of these areas. It's going to speak a lot louder. And one of the things that I would suggest is really looking at the studies that are out there, because there are a lot of studies that are done by reputable organizations that have shown a good minimum 3-to-1 return on investment when you're implementing management systems in a more integrated fashion.
Thank you. Now we will move to the next question. Does reduction of income and wealth impact on the context, as so many other factors are included, such as migration of highly qualified educated workers from a country, especially a developing country losing its professionals?
Well, certainly. I mean, and that's part of the reason why ISO 45001 says that you need to understand the context of the organization, because, this really comes down to what is it that you have to have in place to protect health and safety when you have people who are leaving the organization. So, for example, here in Canada, one of the major issues that we're dealing with is literally a vacuum that's happening in many workplaces because we have so many people who are retiring. And we don't have enough people coming in with the skills and knowledge needed to fill that vacuum. So when people are retiring, or people are leaving, or they're migrating to different areas or different countries, how do you fill that vacuum for the people that are left behind? The organization needs to consider that. One of the things that I've seen is, when you have highly skilled labor leaving, and we've dealt with that a lot in Canada, where highly skilled labor in the medical profession, for example, has left to go elsewhere, and the health and safety of the workers that are left behind, as well as the health and safety of the public, are affected. So, yeah, you have to consider all of those things when you're determining the context of the organization. And certainly for workers that may be moving from one area to another, from one country to another, we can't ignore or downplay their health and safety needs because they're moving to another area where maybe human rights aren't respected as much as they are in the original country, or where the laws are different. That's the beauty of ISO 45001, is it's going to get you to take all of these things into account and determine what do we need to keep our people healthy, safe, and productive. That's the key: healthy, safe, and productive. And you have to know what they're dealing with in order to be able to do that.
Thank you. Will organizations face non-conformances if they do not address mental health as a risk or issue?
I would have to say yes, because the standard includes mental and psychological health as well as physical.
Thank you. Because of the time limitation, the remaining questions will be answered individually by Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I want to thank you once again for this great and very interactive presentation, and I also want to thank all attendees who have joined us today. I want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and will be posted in our website and YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey of the presentation, and we'd really appreciate if you can provide us with your feedback. I hope to see you on our upcoming webinars. Thank you all and have a great day.